Well, welcome back to another amazing episode of the Element Q podcast. I really love being in conversations with people who I care about, people who I've worked with, and Renee Baribeau is one of those people. Renee is a best-selling author. She and I have worked together, I think, for almost 20 years in the field of behavioral health. Welcome to the Element Q podcast. I'm your host, TJ Woodward, and I'm thrilled to have you join us for this empowering journey. Each week, we shine a light on the authors, thought leaders, therapists, coaches, and healers of all types who are making a difference in the LGBTQ plus community. Together, we honor those who came before us, the courageous and resilient trailblazers who stood for our rights and recognition. Their strength laid the foundation we stand on today. Here, we celebrate their legacy by diving into the stories, insights, and tools that inspire gentleness, healing, and transformation. So get ready to be uplifted and empowered. This is the Element Q podcast. Renee, welcome to the show.
Welcome, and I'm really excited to be here with you today, TJ.
Thank you. And, you and I have done conferences together. We have been on each other's shows over the years. And I love that we have the synchronicity of also both being in the LGBTQ plus community. And our conversation, as always, is an organic one. And we see what shows up in terms of our topic of a deeper healing. But of course, before the show started, I asked you what's present for you. And I love what we're going to kick off this conversation with. And that is standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. So I'm going to kick it to you and see what you have to say about that.
There's so much to say about that. And I think it's a topic we don't really think about, especially as we're aging LGBTQ people ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We don't think about the struggle that the people who came before us. And I think it's really important to think about that right now because of the struggle those who are coming after us are facing right now. But last week I bought a house and I knew it was a lesbian couple that owned it. And so I did a little research on them and I found out, one was in their 80s and I think the other one died 20 years ago. So she'd probably be close to 100, but they were both married. One was married in Texas, a real conservative state, and they met in a hospital and they fell in love. And so I actually found an article about them in the newspaper about them being part of the Her Story book on how lesbians came out. And they actually wrote a book about falling in love with another person of the same sex. And that was such an important topic back then, especially if you were married from a more right-wing religious background. To find yourself in love with a woman must have just been a monumental experience.
Wow. And I love that herstory that you get to now step into in your, what you call your forever home, which I absolutely love. And I've seen the view. So great choice. So incredible for you. And I love that history. And I love, I think it's an interesting layered conversation because on one hand, I would love to see the younger generation not even need to be concerned about, the struggle. But at the same time, there's also this history and herstory that is so important within the movement. So it's kind of both and because I love that a young person doesn't have to go through the same thing we did. Of course, we know that there are a lot of layers to that. And, I hear you on Texas being a conservative state, but really to me, it's more urban, suburban, rural, because I lived in urban Texas and it's pretty progressive, but get out into the country and just about any state, including California, including New York. And, maybe it's not as accepted. So obviously things are changing. I know, the era you're talking about, which is more like my parents' generation, perhaps, people just got married. And when we say married, we don't mean to someone of the same gender. We mean they got married to and had a wife and kids or a husband and kids and then came out later. I have a couple of friends who are about maybe 15, 20 years older than I am. And they were both married to each other and they both came out. She came out as a lesbian and he came out as a gay man. This was in the early 70s. So what do you think is the importance of that in terms of being a healer? Because I know you are a healer and your work is about helping people heal, your book, and I know you're working on a new one. I want to hear about that. But how does the history or the herstory show up in helping people heal?
I think those 20-year-olds, when you're coming into 20 and you're leaving home for the first time, one of the things that we fail at in society in general is having rituals.
Mm.
rituals and ceremonies for moving into the transition to the next phase. So the fact that at 2021 I came out, other people, the big thing for them is going to college for the first time and moving out of the home. Something's going to happen then. And so the generation that's following us now, they're having other kinds of issues, but they're still of coming of age issues, whether they're same sex, gender identity, or now, like, how do I want to show up in the world? How do I want to work? How do I even want to go to college anymore? Is that relevant? I think that what we fail to realize is those cycle stories are cycle stories no matter how you identify anyway.
Yes. And I'm thinking about, my own journey and people, I'll just say of my generation that, coming out is really different now for many people. And yet I love what you're leaning into because at the same time, it's like, what is that transition from our teenage years to our early 20s? I think it would be an understatement to say that can be a difficult era of someone's life. That certainly was for me. I mean, it's interesting. I got sober at 20. So my early 20s and sort of that coming of age was also in recovery. And at the same time, it was just as messy, perhaps in so many ways, because I didn't know who I was, right? And trying to figure out not only my sexual identity, my sexual orientation, but so many other things as well. And I know that people are launching later, and it's funny because sometimes people in maybe our generation have judgment of that. I don't think it's necessarily a good or a bad thing, but people are taking longer to kind of leave the nest now. And the 20s seem to me like a time of discovering who we really are. And you add someone's sexual orientation or gender identity into that, and that's just very layered.
Absolutely layered. And then go back forward a little bit to your Saturn return
Yeah.
and talk about some more mess. And for those of you who don't know what that is, like around the 30s, something else is going to come in and move you into the next cycle of experience. So for me, that's when I quit drinking. And
Mhm.
that was really messy because what brought that upon me was that I opened up my restaurant because I launched hard, opened my restaurant doing drugs and alcohol. The very day after my grand opening, my father went home and had a massive stroke. And he was my business partner. He was the money. And it was the first time he had ever shown up in my life.
Mhm.
Because when I came out, he nearly turned white as a ghost in 20 and nearly had that first stroke because he was so awful. And my mother was like, you caused this. Because back then there was a cause and effect for why you were gay. Now, at least we've moved beyond that. I think that coming out period is still an important identification piece, but I don't even know if people are coming out anymore. They're like, well, I see this man and this woman and this, and, we created this plethora of choices for people, and yet you can't move away from the aging cycles.
It's so interesting because I was just hearkening back. You and I worked together at Foundation's recovery network for many, many years. And when I was at Foundation San Francisco, I remember I was the facilitator of the LGBT. We only called it LGBT back then, but the LGBT group. And I remember a young client, he was probably 21. He's like, why do we need that? And I actually loved the question because it would be easy to find that offensive. But he's like, we're more open now. We're more fluid now. We don't necessarily want to be put into one of those letters. And I thought that was very, very fascinating. And I also think about my own journey. Like, I never came out either because, like, I'm one of those people that, like, if people couldn't figure it out within the first 30 seconds, I would be a little concerned, right? I've kind of always been out there. But the deeper work for me was still the shame that was attached to it. And,
Mm-hmm.
when I finally had the conversation with my mother, obviously she knew, but when I finally had the conversation, this was an era, she grew up in the era when the American Psychiatric Association called it a mental defect or a mental disease, which always causes me pause when I look at what they say is a disease now, but that's a whole other conversation, right? Because, we all do the best we can, but it was the overbearing mother and the absent father. That was literally what they said created someone, I think more specifically gay men, but maybe they gave that as a blanket statement. I mean, it's interesting too, if I think about the other letters, you know, lesbian history has a very different history, which I love to lean into, or a very different history. And but there was this, who caused this and what's wrong here and who's to blame.
Right, for sure. And at the time, I was ripe for putting on the blame and putting on the shame because there were so many other areas of my life that, like you said, were so messy. Even when I quit drinking, it was like I had to try everything for the first time, and there was still a big fat mess around it. And I never identified. I don't know if it was the shame. There was a part when I was cooking in New York that I realized that the plate of food I was going to present was the thing that people were going to judge me on. And so that was like the first time I took it off of, oh, I'm a lesbian and I'm going to not fit in. Then I had this restaurant and this woman, this very feminine woman comes in and she's there like, do you have to dress like a boy? Do you have to wear those construction boots and, Cartwright pants? Why can't you be this hip woman downtown who runs this really cool restaurant? But what's the statement you're trying to make, that you don't want anyone to think you're attractive?
Wow.
So there was that piece. But at the time, I felt more masculine. And there wasn't the option of transitioning. Although looking back now, I'm glad that I didn't have that opportunity, because as I healed for me, and I'm not saying this is for everyone, as I healed for me, my identity of who I was became more amorphous to this person who is more fluid, who's kind of always been a little bit on the bisexual range. And I didn't have to dress like a boy anymore because I didn't really care what you thought about me. And I was pretty hip and cool just as I was.
Wow, I love that, Renee, and I totally relate. You're one of the only people who have articulated it in a very similar way that I have, and that is my earliest memories. I didn't necessarily feel gay. I felt more like a girl as a little kid, right? And I say this often, but I think it's, at least I feel somehow it's important to keep repeating. But it was first misogyny. It wasn't homophobia. It was, don't look like a girl, don't act like a girl, don't throw like a girl, don't talk like a girl. And there were these messages that somehow it wasn't okay. And maybe it's misogyny, maybe it's just gender, very rigid ideas of what gender is supposed to be, and we can't waver from that in any way. And I, like you, I imagine if I'd been born 30 years later, I might have transitioned. And what would my life be like, right? What would that be? And I know that it's generational and that consciousness changes. And I agree with you. It's a very nuanced conversation for anyone watching or listening. For me, I'm also grateful that that wasn't my path, but I don't know what the other path would be or what it would feel like. I think sometimes there's a strong focus on the outer presentation rather than the inner work. And I think they're both important. And I want to be clear. I'm not saying if I do the inner work, I won't want or need to transition, but there's also this nuanced conversation around, like, I tried to fix my life from the outside in, and
Mhm.
that was just my 20s and 30s. And I was in recovery, my first 20 years of recovery. And then things kind of fell apart at 40 in a very dramatic way. And I think about Carl Jung, that says we spend our first 40 years developing a healthy ego and the second 40 dismantling it. And it's absolutely been true for me. And so it's a layered conversation, but ultimately we are going to meet ourselves and need to do the deeper healing work.
Absolutely. And that outer presentation of it is only important to you, really, how you show up and how you look in the world. Because I've noticed, we did the Finding Freedom LGBTQ conference, and that's when my sexual identity really started to show up again, because my friends Lauren and then Beck, they said to me, I said, well, I've never fit into the lesbian tribe.
Mm.
And they looked at me, both of them in their own specific way, and said, well, what does that look like? Like like if I never thought I fit in the blue collar worker tribe, I never fit into the LGBTQ tribe. And but I always tried to tribalize everything. And then I could, put myself up not to not belong. And they said, well, you could be any kind of lesbian you want. And that was a game changer for me, that somebody finally gave me permission to do my life the way I want. And what a great thing. There's a guy, it's my 50th high school reunion coming up, and I'm going to be walking the Cotswolds with a group and not going. But there's a guy from high school who's been married for over 40 years. And he goes out and dates men sometimes.
Yeah.
And they've been married for 40 years and they talk about this openly. It's not like a little secret thing. And then there's, a guy that I know who's in the Mormon church and he's trying to find his way, feeling about men and being a good Mormon, which is, I kind of hope that he gets some clarity around that, sometime, but that there is no straight path.
I love that. And I love that you called it a straight path. I think there's many meanings to that, right? I also think, I want to lean into something and perhaps we haven't had this conversation yet on this show, but I have found, and I know it's changing, and I love that Lauren and Beck gave you the permission to be whatever kind of lesbian you want, even if you don't want that label, right? I have found within our community a lot of people not honoring or respecting the bisexual portion of our community, right? Because I have found, especially like I'll speak, about gay men that I know. They'll be like, "Oh yeah, right, you're bisexual. One day you're just going to come fully out and realize you're gay." So for everyone watching and listening, bisexuality does indeed exist. It's not been my experience of this, but I also wonder if there were zero cultural norms where I would really be with that, right? And I think we are living in a time where on one hand we see sometimes people wanting to be put more into groups, more identity, and at the same time less identity, which is really incredible. And I've had both Lauren and Beck on the show, so I love that you mentioned them because they're both trailblazers, as you are, in our community. I want to kind of go back for a moment. I know I'm going with several topics, but I want to just acknowledge you for the years you put into the Finding Freedom conference. I had the honor of speaking several times at that conference and, in Palm Springs, and just a beautiful place for healers and for people in behavioral health to come and have these type of conversations.
And frankly, when Krista and Craig, when I was working at Michael's house, said, "Oh, we want you to do an LGBTQ conference," I'm there like, well, that's a one and done. Like, what are we going to say in year two? I mean, and I had no idea that it was going to open a lot of doorways and a lot of conversations, and it might have ended too soon in terms of all of the disruption we're into now as a community. But these things, when you do it, that's lucky about your conference. When you do a conference for yourself, you have the longevity of it. The new guys that I was working on, they're very different, conservative kind of guys in a different organization. Yeah, they weren't having that topic and they wanted a behavioral healthcare conference. So I spent the next 4 years building that. But the LGBTQ conference gave people permission to come together and talk about the behavioral health, the mental health, the addiction side of a unhealed type of persona, and that it is different for LGBTQ people because of the stigma, because of the shame, because of the sex addiction, because of all of these other things. It adds an elemental layer onto this area of research.
Okay, Renee, I'm going to be bold and we're on the air and not put you
Okay.
under any kind of pressure, but I think you and I can have a conversation offline about reigniting finding freedom. It's been in my consciousness for about 6 months. I haven't yet approached you, so here we are doing it live. It doesn't
Right.
matter what the outcome is, but I do think there is an opportunity for us because I miss it. Just point blank, I miss it. And what I
Hmm.
mean by that is I miss the conversations you're speaking of, by our community, for our community, because there are some unique needs. And I think about the evolution of LGBTQ plus since finding freedom, right?
Hmm.
That we would have some more amazing and different conversations that we weren't even necessarily ready to have back then. So I don't know. I don't know what your first response to that is, but I would love to have that conversation with you. I mean, I do host already one conference a year, but I really have a very special place in my heart for that, what you created and the transformation that I saw happening there. And of course, let's acknowledge Krista Gilbert, Dr. Krista Gilbert, one of my favorite humans on the planet who, did at that point not only have the courage as a leader, but to invite you to create that is such a beautiful thing.
Yes, and meanwhile, we all do things because we need them. I mean, she was going through, you know, quietly this whole thing about, and she did this dance beautifully too, because she was one of our final speakers on the conference when her own child wanted to become something other than what she was, and to watch somebody struggle with that and hold space for it as a mom and as a clinician, and and it was a really brilliant dance to watch.
That talk was so powerful for me. I will
Mhm.
never forget it. And I've actually had some interestingly heated conversations around that talk, which I've loved. And what I mean by that is sometimes someone, just by being authentically who they are, can push buttons. And I think
Mhm.
pushing buttons is a wonderful thing because we get to, I don't mean intentionally, but like she was authentically sharing her journey. Some buttons got pushed, and I had some conversations about that post conference. So, sometimes it's like what happens at the conference, and then it's like this beautiful ripple effect. The conversation's still happening about that talk, and I love that.
Oh, it's so great because I tried and tried for 4 years to get her up on stage to give that talk.
Yeah,
And as any talk, if anything you're working out in your own life, and this is so important, that you can't give the talk before you've worked out some of the messiness in your own, your own living room around these things. And so for her to get to the place where she was willing to even do that talk was courageous, and it was a beautiful talk, and it was so honest. And sitting on the passenger side watching the whole experience unfold, and to know that a parent does have the right to guide their children as they believe is best. And I think in that particular situation that worked out really well.
correct. Because if there's anything Krista brought and brings as a human is let's be in the curiosity of this together,
Mhm.
and being willing to help guide her child while also being open to knowing that like it's a process. So it was so powerful for me and continues to
Mhm.
be. Renee, I want to make sure we have time because we're kind of moving toward the end, believe it or not. Some time to talk about you and your work. I
Okay.
want to hear about the new thing you're doing with recovery people or anything that you want to say about your books and your work. I just want to like take some time with that.
Well, you're hearing it first because I've been really quiet about this, but I just recently left Renewal in Montana Behavioral Health, and it was a really nice 5-year run. I did the Emerging Themes Conference with them over at UCLA,
Mm.
and I don't really know what's next in my life, other than I just bought this beautiful house with the most incredible view of the harbor, look all the way to Orcas Island that I've ever seen in my life. And I just got a new book deal with Inner Traditions. I'm writing the book, The Practical Shaman, and it's kind of been my name for a long, long time. But now I'm really putting what that means into a book. But the thing that would probably interest a lot of your listeners is my Pilgrim's Guide to Walking Wisdom 1111 Insights. Last year, I had we come to other cycles in our life, and last year I came to a cycle that pushed me really hard, and I ended up taking a walk on the Camino, and I this man asked me to walk for him, happened to be gay, and I'm like, well, how am I going to walk for you? But I figured it out, and I did these daily insights, And when I got back, I'm there like, well, those 11 insights really need to go into a book. I
Mm.
wrote them down, and they have really good intentional reflection questions at the end of each chapter. And so I've just started a new program called Walking for Recovery, where, like your program, that you can bring this into your treatment centers and take your clients out for a walk. Because how I got to walking was when I was in a lockdown ward in Queens. The doctor used to take me off that lockdown ward every single day for walks around the neighborhood where we would walk and talk. And what we find, I worked with the alumni from Monterey, was that they didn't even, people weren't even aware of what they were seeing when they were walking. But by bringing that reflection back into how you live your life, it helps you start to manage your day a little bit better. And that's what this is about. And a little different than yours, which is a more advanced training. This is, I'll teach your techs how to use the book, take people for walks, and without a lot of, it's not a core curriculum or anything like that, but it's a great program. And then if you're, if you're more shamanic inclined, of course, I have Winds of Spirit, which is the Bible of the wind spirits. So
I want to go back to this about the walk because I absolutely love it. And there are two things well, there are many things I love about it, but two things that stand out. When I was new in the field, I would take clients on walks. I was at Altamira in Sausalito, beautiful place to take people on walks. We could walk to the sailboats, we could walk, through the hills in the neighborhood. But to have a framework would have been really great for me when I was early. Of course, I was making it up and I did fine with that. But like when I think about techs in the field, a lot of people come into this field and maybe they don't have the experience or the training. So to give them something so powerful and yet simple enough that they can just grab onto, I think that's brilliant, Renee. And there's something about getting people moving that changes the dynamic in a beautiful way. And even though, I mean, Altamira was certainly not like a lockdown ward, it felt like it for people because they couldn't leave those walls, right? So like getting out in nature, getting out to the water is really important.
yeah, and I mean, just a couple of insight for us: take one step at a time, you know, embrace non-judgmental tolerance, drop the should have, could haves, and would haves, and so it gives, like, you don't have to start at the beginning of the book. You could just, ask a better question, and then there's some. How do I ask a better question? And there's some reflection questions. So you just go out. My wind walks are this: you go out, you tell the wind, "Hey, I got this question." Let the wind kiss you on the cheek, and then you take a walk, and you come back. And one of my favorite insights was that one woman noticed she's always looking down, and she thought that on a walk was not such a good thing, but she picked rosemary. And what she didn't know was that the two people behind her saw her picking the rosemary, and they picked the rosemary too. And so what she thought was maybe a negative trait of hers, I said, well, but look, at the other people got rosemary out of your looking down, and somebody else was looking up, and they didn't really even see that those little elemental steps made how they shaped their lives.
One thing I absolutely love is the concept or the practice of living in the question. And I'll invite people in a very similar way. And I love that you're mixing it with a walk. I can see if I were a tech and doing these walks, I would do one question for each walk and just like invite the question at the beginning, do some silence on the walk, and maybe, sit in a beautiful place halfway through the walk. I used to take clients to Muir Wood and we would do the walk in silence and I would give them a question. So it's very synchronistic. I would give them a question, we would be in the silence, and then we'd sit under a redwood tree and share what came up with those questions. What a beautiful practice, because especially people in early recovery, whether that's mental health or addiction treatment, like to not be so focused on what they need to fix that's broken within them, but what question can I ask that will open me up to seeing myself and the world in a new and unique way? That's so powerful, Renee. Thank you for creating that.
That's great. And if anyone's interested in knowing more about it, give me a call.
Perfect. And all of your information, of course, will be in the show notes, including your contact info. So as we come to the end of the conversation, in a moment, I'll give you an opportunity to see if there's anything left that you want to share with the audience, anything that's showing up for you. But I just want to acknowledge you again and say I've loved We haven't ever really exactly worked together, but we've worked in the same orbit over the last like 15 to 20 years, and I've always loved that. So just, thank you for being a guest. Thank you for being who you are. And I love the now what or what's next moment for you. I think I know it's going to be something really great and powerful that's really in alignment with who you are.
It's time. And not yet. It's not yet. There's always the not yet. We haven't worked together yet, and who knows what's coming
Oh, I have two
up the
ideas after
road.
the show is over. We're going to have a little conversation. But is there anything that you want to say in closing to anyone watching or listening now?
Because we were talking about the cycles of your experience, I think that just remember that every experience counts.
Mm.
There's not one moment that's more sacred than another, and that sometimes you can't piece these together until you're looking back from 10 years to see why something happened 10 years ago. It makes sense in the future, but we can tend to discount those moments that aren't going the way we want. And those are some of the most pivotal moments that have shaped my life. And so I hope you just know that every experience is sacred.
Wow, every experience is sacred. And I love that you're framing that I may not understand that until I have some space from it, because even the horrific stuff I went through at 40 years old and 20 years sober, where everything fell apart and I was working in the field and there was all the stuff that came up, that was such a pivotal moment for me in
Mm-hmm.
consciousness. I'm not saying it wasn't painful, but it was something that I couldn't really, I understood enough at that time to realize that my soul was being transformed in some way. But in retrospect, I'm like, I would not change a thing about that experience. So thank you, Renee. My gosh, have I ever just enjoyed our time together. So everyone, if you loved this, which I'm sure you do, like it, subscribe, share. And if there's someone in particular that as you're listening to this conversation you think will resonate, please share this with them, because we at Element Q Podcast really intend to be a ripple effect of healing for the LGBTQ plus community. So thank you, Renee. Peace and blessings, everyone.
Blessings.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Element Q podcast. It's an honor to walk this path of healing and transformation with you. Remember, the courage and resilience of those who came before us live on in each of us. Let's continue to carry their legacy forward as we support one another in creating a world filled with love, gentleness, and empowerment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we're building a brighter future, one story at a time. Until next time, I'm TJ Woodward, and this has been the Element Q Podcast.